It feels like every day we hear about rising CO2 levels and the urgent need to address climate change.
Absolutely. And the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, that seems to get further and further away.
Exactly. It really feels like the clock is ticking, and sometimes I wonder if current efforts are just not enough.
Well, it's true that we need to explore all options and think outside the box when it comes to climate solutions.
And one of the more innovative approaches I've heard about recently is this idea of marine alkalinity enhancement.
Right, right. And this one really focuses on leveraging the power of the Earth's own systems.
Now, for those of us who aren't marine chemists, could you explain what marine alkalinity enhancement actually means?
Sure. So basically, it involves accelerating a natural process that occurs over a very long geological timescale.
Okay.
The weathering of rocks and minerals naturally increases the ocean's alkalinity, right? And this higher alkalinity allows the ocean to absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere.
So essentially, we're giving the ocean a little boost in its natural carbon-absorbing abilities.
Exactly. We're trying to speed up that natural process by introducing finely ground rocks like olivine and basalt into marine environments.
And I imagine those minerals, as they dissolve, further enhance that alkalinity and therefore the ocean's ability to soak up CO2.
That's the idea. But of course, there's a big leap from doing this in a controlled lab setting to actually implementing it in the dynamic, complex environment of the real world.
Right, because we can run all the simulations and lab experiments we want, but the real test is how this plays out in a natural ecosystem.
Yeah, we need to see how it interacts with existing plant and animal life, ocean currents, and all those other factors you can't replicate in the lab.
Which brings us to a really exciting new study. Researchers actually conducted a field experiment in a salt marsh in southern Portugal to test this concept in a real-world setting.
That's right. It took place at the Ria Formosa coastal lagoon, and it's one of the first studies to really look at the potential of marine alkalinity enhancement in situ.
Very cool. So in this deep dive today, we're going to explore this experiment, how it was designed, what they've learned so far, and what it could mean for the future of climate action.
Exactly. And hopefully we can answer the question, could this be a viable solution for tackling climate change?
Okay, let's start with the location. Why did they choose a salt marsh for this experiment? It doesn't seem like the most obvious choice.
It's a good question. They specifically chose a zone within the salt marsh called the Pioneer Vegetation Zone.
Okay.
It's this area right next to the mudflats found in these more sheltered bays and coastal lagoons. And this area is really important because it's dominated by this really hardy plant called Spartina maritima. It's also known as cordgrass.
Okay.
And these plants play a crucial role in creating a stable environment.
How so?
Their dense root system helps to dampen wave energy and prevent erosion, which is super important for an experiment like this where you don't want your materials getting washed away.
That makes sense. You want a solid foundation for your experiment.
Exactly. Plus, long-term monitoring in this specific area of Ria Formosa showed that there's basically no net accumulation of sediment over time.
So it's a stable environment in terms of both water movement and sediment buildup.
Precisely. It's the perfect natural laboratory for this kind of study.
All right, so they've got their location.
Yeah.
Now, how did they actually set up this experiment? What did it look like?
Well, they built these experimental units out of pine wood frames. Each one was 60 centimeters by 60 centimeters, and they were secured together using stainless steel screws.
Stainless steel, I'm guessing, to avoid corrosion in the saltwater environment.
Exactly. These frames were designed to hold the different mineral substrates they were testing and keep them contained, so the researchers could take measurements without everything just scattering with the tides.
Smart thinking.
The inner corners were even reinforced for extra stability.
So sturdy little boxes, basically.
Pretty much. And importantly, the pine wood was untreated, so no preservatives or paint. They wanted to keep things as natural as possible.
I like that attention to detail, minimizing any potential influence from artificial materials.
So these frames were placed directly in the salt marsh. How did they organize the different materials within them?
So they set up 3 identical plots within the salt marsh, basically repeating the experiment in 3 different locations. And then within each plot, they had 5 distinct experimental fields.
Okay.
One for fine-grained basalt, one for coarse basalt, one for fine-grained olivine, one for coarse olivine, and finally, one that was left completely untouched as a control.
That makes sense. A good experimental design with replicates and a control group.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about those minerals. Where did they get the olivine and basalt, and were there any key differences between them?
So the olivine, a type rich in picrobasalt, came from Norway. They had two grades, a fine one, AFS 120, and a medium coarse one, AFS 50. The basalt, which was more accurately a basanite, came from Germany. For that, they used Darubis, and a fine fraction that they obtained by sieving Darubis, and then basalt Fugen-sand.
And these two types of minerals, olivine and basalt, they have different properties, right? Yeah, their mineral compositions vary quite a bit, which affects how much CO2 they can potentially capture. The olivine samples, both fine and coarse, were over 92% olivine, with the rest being small amounts of other minerals. The basalt samples, on the other hand, had higher percentages of other minerals like pyroxene and plagioclase, ranging from 68 to 73%, with only a moderate amount of olivine.
So how does that difference in composition affect their CO2 absorbing potential?
Well, theoretically, olivine can capture about 1 ton of CO2 for every ton of olivine. Basalt, on the other hand, has a capacity that's about 30% less.
So olivine seems to be the winner in terms of pure CO2 capture.
It is, at least theoretically. But there's an interesting twist with basalt. As it dissolves, it releases important nutrients for plants, things like phosphorus, calcium, potassium, silicon, and zinc. So in a way, it could act as a slow-release fertilizer, which could have additional benefits for the ecosystem.
So olivine is the CO2 champion, but basalt might offer some bonus perks for the surrounding environment. Okay, back to the experiment itself. How did they actually get those minerals into the plots?
They chose to use sand-sized grains of both minerals. This ensures good water flow and interaction, which is crucial for the weathering process.
Makes sense. Easier to handle and disperse as well, I imagine.
Exactly. They carefully measured the density of both the dry olivine and basalt materials and then calculated exactly how much they would need to create the desired layer thickness inside the frames.
And how thick were these layers?
They aimed for a 1 centimeter layer for the basalt and a 0.5 centimeter layer for the olivine. These pre-weighed amounts were then carefully spread out inside the frames. They used small plastic shovels to do this, aiming for an even distribution.
Okay, so we have these neat little plots set up, minerals in place. How did they actually track what was happening?
They had a pretty comprehensive monitoring plan in place. Every month they would go out and collect water samples, both from the water that accumulated in the frames, which they called supernatant water, and also from the water within the sediment itself, the porewater.
I see. And how did they get those porewater samples? It sounds tricky.
They use these things called rhizon samplers, which are basically thin tubes with porous walls that you insert horizontally into the sediment.
That's pretty clever.
Yeah. And then to provide context, they also collected samples of the surrounding lagoon water.
And what exactly were they measuring in all these water samples?
Quite a lot, actually. They measured basic things like temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, and pH.
The essentials.
Right. But the most important measurement was total alkalinity. Remember, that's the key indicator of how much CO2 the water can absorb.
Right.
They also analyzed for various nutrients like ammonium, nitrate, phosphate, and silicic acid. And they also kept an eye on trace metals, things like nickel, copper, and chromium, to check for any potential environmental impacts.
They were leaving no stone unturned. I noticed they were very specific about when they collected these samples.
Yeah.
Why was that?
Oh, that's because parameters like oxygen, pH, and the overall chemical composition of porewater in a salt marsh can fluctuate quite a bit throughout the day, especially in the near surface layers.
Oh, I see.
So to minimize the influence of these daily variations, they always collected their samples during the ebb period of the first low tide after sunrise.
So they were trying to control for the natural daily rhythms of the salt marsh.
Exactly. Keep things as consistent as possible for more accurate data. And for the porewater specifically, they made sure to collect the samples as soon as the tide went out and the sites were exposed to avoid any changes that might occur as the sediment started drying.
Okay, very precise. So once they had these samples, what did they do with them? How did they analyze them?
Well, for the parameters they could measure in the field, like temperature, salinity, oxygen, and pH, they used a handy multi-parameter probe. But the other samples, those had to go back to the lab for more detailed analysis.
And how did they actually measure something like total alkalinity?
They used a method called Bruivich's titration, which is really good for analyzing small volumes of water, perfect for field studies. And to make sure their measurements were super accurate, they used an internationally recognized IAPSO standard for quality control. For the nutrients, they used spectrophotometric methods, which involve adding specific chemicals to the samples and then measuring how much light they absorb.
Okay.
And for trace metals, the samples were filtered and acidified before being analyzed.
It sounds like they were very thorough. So they were looking at the water chemistry, but did they also observe anything else happening at the experimental sites?
Oh yeah, absolutely. During those monthly sampling visits, they also documented all sorts of other things. They took photos, estimated how much of the ground was covered by vegetation, measured the height of those Spartina plants, and noted any visible signs of animal life, both living and dead. They even looked for signs of sediment disturbance, like burrows created by crabs and worms.
Really getting a full picture of the ecosystem.
Exactly. They also kept track of how many new Spartina shoots were sprouting up in each plot. And of course, they also recorded weather data like air temperature, rainfall, and wind conditions.
Makes sense. All important factors to consider. Now, to minimize their own impact on the salt marsh while they were working, I read that they used a rather unique method.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about the sporting bodyboard.
Yes, that's a cool way to tread lightly and distribute their weight. So, after all that meticulous work, what did they actually find? What were some of the key observations in the first 6 months?
One of the first things they checked was whether the conditions were consistent across the 3 replicate plots. And to their relief, the statistical analysis showed no significant difference in oxygen saturation in the pore water between those 3 plots.
So a good indication that they had consistent conditions across the experiment.
Precisely. Now for the big question, did they see an increase in alkalinity? And the answer is yes. They found a statistically significant increase in total alkalinity in the pore water of all the fields where they had added olivine or basalt compared to the control. And this was confirmed using several different statistical tests.
So the minerals were doing their job, at least in terms of boosting alkalinity in the pore water. What about the other environmental parameters they were measuring? Did they see any immediate impacts on things like salinity or pH?
For the most part, those parameters remained pretty stable. Salinity, oxygen, and pH were all quite similar to what they observed in the control conditions throughout the 6 months.
Okay.
There was a slight dip in salinity in December 2022, but that was likely due to a big rainfall event right before they took those samples, so probably just freshwater runoff, not anything to do with the minerals.
Makes sense. So the alkalinity went up, but the overall environment seemed to stay relatively stable.
Right.
Did they notice any patterns in how that alkalinity increase happened over time?
Yeah, interestingly, the highest alkalinity values were measured right after they deployed the materials. The researchers think that's because the finest particles within the mineral substrates dissolve the fastest.
That makes intuitive sense. The smaller particles have more surface area exposed, so they react more quickly.
Exactly. After that initial burst of alkalinity, there was a slower but still steady increase. That's probably due to the coarser particles continuing to dissolve, just at a slower pace.
Okay. So where exactly was this increase in alkalinity most pronounced?
They consistently found the highest alkalinity levels in the pore water, the water within the sediment. The supernatant water, the water that pooled on the surface, had slightly lower alkalinity. And the lowest alkalinity levels were in the water of the adjacent tidal channel.
I see.
So this gradient suggests that the minerals were producing alkalinity locally, which then slowly diffused into the surrounding water.
So it's not just changing the chemistry right where the minerals are, it's actually having a measurable effect on the surrounding water as well.
That's right.
Now, we know that the weathering process, which increases alkalinity, also consumes CO2 from the atmosphere. Were the researchers able to get any sense of how much CO2 might have been captured, even at this small scale?
They explained that by tracking the changes in alkalinity, they can actually calculate how fast specific minerals are dissolving.
Interesting.
So they gave the example of wollastonite, which is a type of pyroxene found in their basalt samples. When wollastonite weathers, it essentially consumes CO2 from the air and forms bicarbonate ions.
And bicarbonate, that's a major component of alkalinity.
Exactly. So for every bicarbonate ion formed, one CO2 molecule is removed from the atmosphere.
That's pretty cool. So by carefully monitoring the alkalinity changes, they can estimate how effectively each type of mineral is capturing CO2.
That's the idea. It's still early days, but those measurements will help them understand the overall potential of this approach.
So far, this all sounds really promising as a potential climate solution. But like any experiment, I'm sure there were challenges and limitations. What did the researchers themselves highlight as the strengths and weaknesses of their approach?
Well, they were really pleased with how well their method of containing the minerals within those wooden frames worked. Even with the regular tides, the material stayed put.
That's good.
And they didn't see any negative effects from the frames themselves on the surrounding sediment or any signs of erosion around them.
That's reassuring.
Another plus was that their sampling methods for both the supernatant and porewater worked well. They were able to gather enough samples for all their analyses, and the choice to use those sand-sized mineral grains turned out to be a good one because it allowed for good water flow and interaction.
Smart choices.
Plus, the uneven surface of the salt marsh, which might seem like a disadvantage, actually made it easier to collect those porewater samples using the rhizon samplers. And very importantly, the materials and equipment they used were all relatively cheap and easy to get, and the initial setup of the experiment was pretty straightforward, just a couple of days of work.
So a relatively low-cost, low-tech setup, which is always a good thing when you think about scaling something up in the future. But what about the limitations?
Of course, there were some. One obvious one is the small size of those experimental plots. Each one was only 0.36 square meters, which is tiny compared to the scale at which this approach might need to be implemented to have a real impact on climate change. Some proposals have suggested areas of 100 square meters or even larger for future trials.
Yeah, that's a pretty big jump in scale.
It is. And because they were spreading the minerals by hand, there might have been some slight inconsistencies in the thickness of the layer. Plus, they observed that over time, a thin layer of mud started to cover parts of the mineral substrates.
Oh, how did that happen?
They think it's probably due to those burrowing creatures like crabs and worms, a process called bioturvation, where the sediment gets mixed around. They also saw some temporary growth of algae and cyanobacteria on the surface, and during the winter, there was a seasonal growth of larger macroalgae, which they think could potentially interfere with the weathering process by blocking the minerals from the water.
Okay, and then there's always the challenge of working in a natural environment.
Right. Even though they took precautions, they couldn't completely avoid some level of disturbance to the salt marsh just by being there. And of course, it's really hard to predict and control for things like storms, which can cause sediment to move around, or the constant activity of those burrowing creatures, which, as we said, can mix up the sediment and bury the minerals.
And that unpredictable nature of the real world is one of the things that makes field experiments like this so valuable.
Absolutely. They also pointed out some interesting differences between their findings in the field and some results from laboratory studies. Some lab experiments showed a rapid increase in alkalinity that then leveled off, while others even showed a decrease after a short period. So this really underscores the importance of doing these in situ studies. You just can't fully replicate the complexity of the real world in a lab.
So this field experiment is giving us a much-needed real-world perspective. What are the next steps for this research? And what broader implications might these initial findings have for carbon capture strategies?
Well, the researchers are particularly excited about the fact that they're studying both the chemical changes and the ecological responses, how the local plants and animals are being affected. That's something that a lot of lab-based studies just can't do.
Yeah, getting that full picture is so important.
Absolutely. And a big question that they're now investigating is what happens to those trace metals that are released as the minerals dissolve. How much is released? Does it become bioavailable? Does it accumulate in the food web? And what's its ultimate fate?
That's a crucial question for understanding any potential risks if this approach were to be scaled up.
Right. Their preliminary results suggest that the concentrations haven't reached harmful levels, but they are seeing the release of essential nutrients, which could actually be beneficial.
Right. And it would be fascinating to see how those released nutrients might affect the overall health and productivity of the salt marsh ecosystem in the long term.
Definitely. They're also monitoring the growth of those Spartina plants to see if the mineral substrates have any long-term effects, positive or negative.
And speaking of long-term, what happens to all those minerals once the experiment is finished?
That's a great question, and it's one they're still figuring out. It would be pretty tricky to remove the minerals without causing a lot of damage to the salt marsh.
I can imagine.
So one option might be to just leave the materials there and let them continue to weather naturally, eventually becoming part of the sediment. They even think that the unweathered grains that get buried could keep increasing the alkalinity of the soil for quite a while in a sustainable way.
So potentially a win-win.
Possibly. And that leads to a bigger question. Could enhancing weathering in salt marshes be a better, more cost-effective, and environmentally friendly way to capture carbon compared to other strategies like restoring mangrove forests or seagrass meadows?
That's a big question, but an important one. It's all about finding the most effective and sustainable solutions. And for listeners who are interested in diving deeper into the data from this experiment, I understand that information is publicly available.
Yes, the researchers have made their data sets available in the Figshare repository. You can find a link in the show notes.
Fantastic. So this study really gives us a glimpse into the potential of marine alkalinity enhancement, but it also highlights the need for further research.
Absolutely. These initial results showing that we can increase alkalinity in the treated areas are really promising, but we still need to investigate the long-term impacts and the feasibility of scaling this up.
This experiment really forces us to think about the complex interactions within these ecosystems. How can we balance the pursuit of innovative climate solutions with the need to protect delicate environments like salt marshes?
It's a constant balancing act, but a necessary one. And the more we understand about these interconnected systems, the better equipped we'll be to find solutions that benefit both the planet and the ecosystems that support us.
Well said. And that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of marine alkalinity enhancement.
It was my pleasure.
And to all our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Until next time.